But first, why don't we just go through brief introductions and then we'll jump in. So, Dr. Dave.
Well, I'm David Albert. I'm the founder and chief medical officer of Livecore. And speaking of GE, in 2001, GE bought the last company I started, Data Critical, and I was the chief clinical scientist of GE Cardiology for 3 years. Didn't stay for life. I left academic medicine about 35 years ago to become an entrepreneur. It was the dumbest move I ever made in my life, but it worked for me.
So I'm Ashutosh Banerjee. I'm the general manager for Diagnostic, Cardiology and RPM at GE Healthcare. So Diagnostic Cardiology is actually the only business in the company focused on one parameter, the ECG, and that's how Dr. Dave and we got talking. I'm not a GE lifer either. Been there actually been 10 years now, so it's been quite a while. But we in Diagnostic Cardiology, and a lot of the themes today were around the whole continuum and decentralization of healthcare, where the care, the point of care and so on. A lot of that is what we work on to make sure that we have a continuum of care and we can bring the right information to the clinicians to make the right decisions.
That's great, thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, I love to hear the stories of how startups started. Talk to us about Alivecor and what was the inspiration? How did this all come together?
Well, the 30-second version is that I had an idea in the early days. Now, most of the people in here, I can tell, are not old enough. Anybody here remember a Palm Pilot?
Oh, yeah.
I know a few of you do.
Unfortunately, yes.
And anybody remember when we had analog cellular modems? Well, in 1995, in the company I ultimately sold to GE, I had an idea that what if a patient could send their EKG directly to a doctor, and that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line? And so we built something, and we actually got an FDA 510K and got a patent, and we never commercialized it because it was a Rube Goldberg. Anybody old enough to remember Rube Goldberg and all those machines? It was not practical. And then came the advent of the iPhone, and 18 months after 2007, the App Store. And so in 2010, along with a couple of partners, I said we can take this smartphone and make my idea from 1995 into a reality, and we did. And today, millions. And I should be flattered. The world's biggest companies have come into competition with me on your smartwatches, whether it's an Apple or an Android or a Samsung. And but we've sold millions of devices. We have 180 peer-reviewed publications. We have scores of patents, and that nutty idea in 1995 is today, I would think, common, with tens of millions of devices being sold every year around the world. So maybe it was a good idea.
And the device, the Livecore device itself is what exactly for the
well,
audience?
People may be familiar. Anybody here ever see one of our Cardio Mobile commercials on television? Nobody? Okay.
No, that's the
obviously,
feedback.
we're not advertising, so you obviously don't watch Fox News.
You're going to leave that one alone.
Yeah, exactly. We make a family of devices. Cardio Mobile is a device that sells for under $80, but we have a device called the Cardio Mobile 6L, and today we have a credit card size device, literally the Cardio Mobile card, which sells for under $100, that fits in your wallet and has a 2-year battery life. And that is, I can tell you, that's an engineering tour de force. You can imagine has everything from Bluetooth to microprocessor to analog electronics and a battery in the size of a credit card. So we make personal devices. We have services that go with them. And recently, we've partnered with my old friends at GE Healthcare and Diagnostic Cardiology. Full disclosure, they're now a significant investor in my company, have a seat on the board of directors, but we see great synergies going forward because, why? What we've heard today, tying the hospital to the home, because we're going to have a continuum of care that goes from your bedroom to the ICU.
That's great. Ashutosh, in regards to, you'd obviously known him a little bit, but what was the inspiration for, the partnership? What did you see, and what holes or solutions was it, providing to GE Healthcare, particularly when it comes to cardiology and your large machines, or now smaller machines, and imaging? But what interested you, in regards to Alivecor, and why the partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. So at GE Healthcare, we work on some of the themes that we talked about this today, all day today. Focus on the patient, making patient-centric innovation, making patient-centric workflows, and looking at distributed care models. So we have been looking at distributed care. We call it when the clinician is not at the bedside. So think of anything called digital, right? This word has been overused, but what we typically think of digital as when the clinician is not at the bedside. How do you give the clinician the information that is needed to make decisions which are for better patient outcome? One of those informations resides outside the hospital. And as we all talked about this morning, COVID accelerated the flow of information from outside the hospital. So we have been speaking with Livecore, forever, I think, Dr. Dave. But I think over the last 6 years, we said that if we need to complete the cardiac continuum, we need to tie in the information together. We are strong as GE Healthcare in the hospital. We have all the information within the hospital. But soon as the patient leaves the hospital, we have no information there, right? How do we get the information from outside the hospital? From their clinically relevant, peer-reviewed set of data that they create from their devices. And it's actually one of the most clinically accurate devices around. And I'll illustrate the use case for a patient with an anecdote. So a colleague of mine, actually, who works in our department, I'll not name him, but he one day when it was snowing quite heavily, he was shoveling in his driveway. He felt a shortness of breath, and he thought, well, it's fine. He's a healthy man. Maybe he didn't exercise enough, right? So he just went back in and then came out after an hour, felt the shortness of breath again. Then his wife told him that you design ECGs, don't be the guy who dies of heart attack but you design ECGs, right? So he actually had an Alivecor device, which we have been talking with them for a while. So I had given it to my staff as a swag in one of the meetings. He used it, and because he knows how to read ECGs, he figured out there's something wrong with the ECG. He went to the hospital, he had a 90% block, he got a bypass done, that saved his life. But it needed him to know how to read an ECG. Think about if that process was automated and that ECG would have gone into the doctor. Somebody should have called him and said, come on in, we need you in the hospital, right? Think about how many patients die because that connection is not made. So that's sort of the real driver behind the reason we partnered.
So walk us through a little bit, just exactly how this works. So what kind of data is getting to the cardiologist? Getting through GE Healthcare, and then the cardiologists that are associated with GE. How does this actually work? Take us through. Us through the flow.
I'm a patient, and I feel something,
Yeah.
and I have one of these devices, and I'm connected to a cardiologist. By the way, just FYI, we all have apps, we download them. What do you think the biggest decade is for an Alivecor customer? Anybody have a guess? 60 to 70. What's the second biggest decade? 70 to 80. 50 to 60 is the third. So the vast majority of these people are actually patients, or their doctor recommended because they can't capture something, they keep coming in and they don't find anything. So this patient feels something, takes their ECG, it is automatically uploaded. They don't have to do anything. Once he's recorded it, he gets a preliminary diagnosis, but it's uploaded into the GE ECG management system in the hospital. Let's pick one, Mayo Clinic, partner of both of ours. And there, a cardiologist and acute care people see it immediately and respond. Yeah, you're in atrial fibrillation, or you're having supraventricular tachycardia, and contact the patient. That's closing the loop that Ashutosh talked about, and that's only possible because, what's critical inside the hospital? How do hospitals work? Workflow. If you try to come in with an asynchronous solution, and most digital health solutions are asynchronous, that is, they operate outside that hospital-based workflow, you're going to have a very difficult time integrating that into the record, into the care of that patient. And so what's powerful for Livecore is that this enables us to be into the workflow that those EKGs that the GE equipment records live in. And so we become part of the standard workflow, and that patient who doesn't know how to read ECGs gets served appropriately. And we're just beginning this, but it's an exciting beginning.
And in regards to leveraging the data over time, there's one thing if there's an incident and you solve a problem, unfortunately you take care of somebody immediately that needs immediate care. Is it leveraging the data also in terms of, you should come in and check up in 6 months or whatever it might be, in terms of a continuum of care is not just solving sort of an emergency,
Yep.
But the ongoing care. How are you leveraging the data and the relationship to do that?
Yeah, so in ECG, I think there are a lot of clinicians in the room, so you have to have a baseline for the ECG, right? So we, as a clinician who is reading EKGs or ECGs, you already look at the baseline, you are already making comparisons with the previous, right? What this allows us to do is to track it and visualize it over a period of time, right? So, the possibilities are endless, and we are working on a few things that can make it even better tomorrow. But we want to start out with making sure that, first of all, you get all the information, there's no gap in the information. And when a patient is in atrial fibrillation, there is no guarantee that the patient goes to the hospital and has an event. You have to have it when there was an event, right? So that's why there is this needless thing about putting a diagnostic on again and again, even though they found an event at home, right? So that is still a big problem to solve today. And allowing the whole set of information to be tracked over a period of time longer than what it is tracked today is a lot of value in itself and allows us to do more tomorrow.
And from GE Healthcare's perspective more generally, and looking out at, from an innovation standpoint, where else are you looking in terms to innovate, not just specifically within cardiology and that area? GE Healthcare is about to be an independent company, so maybe focus a little more on innovation without pressure from the mothership. But what's on your radar as you look ahead?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And the spin-off is something we at GE Healthcare are really looking forward to. Don't quote me on that, please. The super boss may not like it. But seriously though, when our focus is on creating, this word is overused, but it's actually a real word, the whole ecosystem of data, right? And it's not just about having cardiology data. Somebody told me once that there is nothing called a singular event. You have, everything is connected. You have there are multiple events or multiple conditions that happen to a patient, right? So we are looking at the connected care. We are looking to create a whole care continuum for the patients in the hospital and beyond, right? We are looking to get that data from disparate sources. So as GE Healthcare, we have imaging, we have ECGs, we have ultrasound, we have all sorts of imaging data, we have live stream data, we have patient monitoring data. They are all different kinds of data. And we talked about data today, all of the different kinds of data in the previous architecture can't go into one data repository. So how do you make sure all the data goes to one place? You use a data mesh and make sure that you can look at it, right? So we are, with our Edison platform, we are creating that sort of a data repository, which allows us to get the right information and the insights from that at the right place. So our focus is on creating an ecosystem with self-created applications and partner-driven applications like Livecore is an example. And how do we put that in our data repository and make sense of it and get insights to the clinicians?
Great. And I'm going to encourage anybody to ask a question in just 1 minute, so think about a question if you have one. Dr. Dave, I'd sort of like to ask you, outside of your product, which you spend a lot of time on, it's your life, if you were a young entrepreneur in this space and factoring in some of your advice, like understand the hospital flow first and other things like that, particularly in the area perhaps of cardiology or even more broadly, like where are the needs, and what would you start up today if you still weren't running a Livecore? Where are the opportunities, whether it's helping a company like GE Healthcare, whether it's helping a hospital system, helping patients?
Well, first of all, I would say the first thing you have to look at, entrepreneurs have great ideas, okay? In healthcare especially, what they don't think about in digital health is, who's going to pay for this? If you hear, direct-to-consumer is a very challenging space. Let me just say that maybe a dozen years ago I went to GE and they said, well, nobody's going to spend $100 for an EKG,
Maybe.
Dave. Yeah, well, at the time, that's probably was true. But the world changed. Anybody here think your deductibles and copays are going to go down? Anybody think? How about you think they're going to stay the same? No, they're not. So we're going to become more responsible financially for our healthcare. And I think what that means is we're going to be more engaged in it. And that was a process, I wish I could say I predicted it and that I was skating to where the puck was going. I was lucky. But that's where it is. And so I think you need to think about who's going to pay for my service. Are all these health systems going to pay? Are the payers going to pay? We heard from Aetna, from CVS Aetna. That you have to work that out. What's the business model that's going to fund your business? Because you can raise a lot of money, but unless you start generating revenue, it's still a dead end. So that's the recommendation I'd give for your great idea, is figure out how to turn it into a revenue generating idea.
That's great. And we didn't really have this in the questions, but I'm going to follow up with you. It's a similar question, but from GE Healthcare's perspective, we've talked a lot about open innovation today. How are you engaging startups? Do you have a sort of external innovation ecosystem engagement program? That's a lot of words and a lot of vowels. In terms of engaging startups and finding more companies like Alivecor, do you have a process behind that?
No, we do. So I think as part of GE, we have done quite a few, let's say, accelerators under our Edison ambit. We have done one in the Europe region. We have done one in Asia. We haven't done one specifically in the US, but as we spin off, I'm sure we'll do more of it. We do a lot of hackathons internally as well. So our goal on the Edison platform is twofold. One is to make sure that we have the right data, because if you know the hospital space, all the data is not available today. All devices, data resides in their devices, but is not available centrally to use anything, right? So that's the first thing. How do you liberate the data? Second is, how do you put that in an ecosystem? And GE alone cannot be expected to get the insights from it that the clinicians need. So we are creating an ecosystem with partners as well. And that's a key focus for us from the Edison point of view.
That's great. So we do have time for a question here for Alivecor or GE. So we'll have the mic come around to you here. And if you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I'm Joanna Kemp from Bristol Myers Squibb. I'm curious for GE, there's obviously a lot of cardiac data available for consumers through Apple Watch and many other at-home devices. So how are you guys approaching, is Livecore one avenue to integrate some of that data into a health system, and there are many more to come? Or do we continue to see consumer wearables living outside of health system data?
I would say the latter, where consumer wearables will continue to live outside the hospital space for two reasons. One, the fact that we need to be in a workflow that is reimbursed and that you can get paid for. Otherwise, that never takes off, right? So we are looking at information or devices that get prescribed, because then the physician is going to use the data and it is helpful to the patient outcome, right? And the second thing is that, honestly, there are a lot of startups out there, and in my role, I've looked at tons of them. And what Dr. Dave said is people actually think it's a great technology idea, but they forget about the whole workflow and how to implement it and how to verify and validate the information. So we make a claim that it is good at detecting XYZ, but we have not done any validation, right? So we found them, and very few companies have really focused on that. So we are very picky about who we partner with, because it goes into the GE ecosystem and we need the physicians to be able to use it and make sense out of it. So I think Dr. Dave has done a phenomenal job in making sure his company does it.
Name another digital health company that has 180 peer-reviewed publications. There isn't one. And it has Mayo Clinic, Mass General, Cleveland Clinic, Cedars-Sinai, UCSF as customers and partners. That took a long time. That's why I'm so old, okay? But young people do not despair. There's still room for innovation. Just think about who's going to pay.
Yeah.
Real quick, I know we have one of our students in here today, so thank you. You can introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm not a student, but my name's Donson. I'm a founder of a platform called Bluma. We're working with hospitals and sponsors to connect them to research participants, particularly from rare disease and diverse backgrounds. And so my question is for you, Dr. Albert, about asynchronous versus sort of synchronous digital health solutions. So you mentioned obviously it's preferable to have a synchronous solution where it's just integrated into the workflow, but a lot of these digital health solutions and these devices like the Apple Watches can't be integrated into the workflow. So what would you say is important in terms of that consideration, in terms of the feasibility of adopting a solution that can still work outside of the existing EHR ecosystem or the existing sort of daily workflow of a physician?
Well, it is challenging, first of all, because remember, if you're a doctor and you're taking care of a patient, you have to document everything. Forget about even getting paid for it and billing. You still have to document, otherwise you're liable, okay? So it is challenging, and people like Apple and Google, Fitbit just announced, are trying to integrate their data into the EMR, trying to bring it in. But one thing I can tell you is doctors are faced, caregivers of all types, with a data tsunami. And what we have to do as providers is turn, I haven't heard the term, nobody's been talking about deep neural networks and AI very much this morning, but these are going to be critical because the data tsunami has to be turned into insights. Nobody wants to see 3 inches of your weight, blood pressure, step, ECG data. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? I want to have an indicator on my dashboard. And so I would tell you, if you're recruiting patients, that's separate. That's going into the CRO clinical trial space. But to come into the direct patient care space, you're going to have to figure out how to integrate into that environment. That's a challenge and another thing for you to think about.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's a great partnership, and it's great to have both of you here. A round of applause for GE.
Thank you.